Welcome to another panel of the Financial Market Week of PUC-Rio. My name is Felipe, I'm the Events Director of the Financial Market Club, and I'm very honored to present Professor John Cochrane, Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution, and Marcos Mollica, Partner and Macro Portfolio Manager at Opportunity. Today, we'll be discussing some topics related to the U.S. economic outlook. But first, I would like you both to introduce yourself. Would you mind going first, John?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Hi, everybody. I'm John Cochrane. I'm currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And for a long time, I was a professor of finance and economics at the University of Chicago. And I also have a blog, The Grumpy Economist, which I always recommend that you read if you're interested in blog type stuff. And it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Hi, I'm Marcos Mollica. I'm an economist. I don't know if, probably he doesn't remember, but John was my professor in Chicago. I did 2 courses with John there. I remember monetary economics and asset pricing was one of the best teachers there. Now I moved from the academia. I'm now managing a fund. It's a macro fund in Opportunity. And I'm very happy to be here with you.
Oh, great. Thank you, guys. And first, I'd like to ask you both about the inflationary, the inflation. Like, is the inflation in the United States, is it really temporary? Does the Fed have the instrument and the willingness to control inflation?
Who wants to go first? Marcos?
No, you can go. You are our guest.
Okay. Well, this is a big and hard topic. And forecasting inflation is hard for the same reason that forecasting stock prices is hard. If anybody knew for sure that there would be inflation next year and you're a businessman, what do? You raise prices today. And if you're a worker, you demand a higher wage today. So I just proved to you that inflation is unforecastable. And that is, so I'm not going to come up with forecasts, but what can we do? We can kind of put on our whatever intellectual frameworks we have to think about this question. So it is true that prices went down in the COVID recession in the U.S. and they came back up again to where they had been. There's nothing magic about where prices used to be. There's this sort of, the first thing is, oh, well, it's just coming back to where they used to be. Well, there's nothing in economics that says the price of tomatoes today has anything to do with where the price of tomatoes was last February, except I guess seasonals or something. And now the fact is that inflation is much higher than that. So what really woke people up, whether that makes any sense or not, what woke people up is, in the US at least, we have a substantial burst of inflation above and beyond bringing prices back to where they were before the pandemic hit. So is that going on or not? Good question. So what frameworks can we think about this in? One, I tend to think in fiscal terms about inflation. One way of thinking about what's happened is that the US government printed up a lot of money and threw it out. Now, it looks, debt and money looks the same. Actually, we did, most of our money was bought Latin American style directly by the central bank. Sorry, guys. So in fact, we did print up a lot of money and send it to every registered voter. And that kind of thing, if it's a one-time thing, can cause a one-time increase in the price level. So there's one conceptual framework. Now, so that makes you think, well, was this a one-time thing? Or is the US government going to keep printing up debt like a drunken sailor or like a Venezuelan? I won't. Brazil has actually had a good history on occasions of controlling inflation. Well, actually, Brazil's lessons for the U.S. is something I hope to learn about today. So is this going to continue or not? It looks like it's going to continue. So that doesn't look great as far as intellectual framework. But there's a state contingent default is a beautiful idea from economics that Marcos will remember from his time at Chicago. That if you're in a one-time emergency, governments often print up a one-time stock of money and therefore default on some of their outstanding debt to meet the emergency. Maybe you can read that as what's happened. If that's what's happened, then it should be one time. But I see the U.S. is in for structural deficits of trillions of dollars for the duration. and then things get worse when our entitlements hit. So the idea that this is a one-time fiscal expansion, I'm not so sure. There are supply bottlenecks, and the idea is that those will ease. Well, maybe those will ease. I mean, the U.S. government pays people not to work, so unsurprisingly, it's really hard to get workers right now, and wages are going up, and goods are scarce, so prices are going up. There's hope that that will ease, but if you keep goosing demand more than there's supply, things keep going. Now, I haven't mentioned the words Federal Reserve, and a lot I think about what's going on is what happens with Federal Reserve policy. I'm a fiscal theorist, so the Federal Reserve is only part of you need both fiscal and monetary policy to contain inflation, but monetary policy is important. So the Fed keeps saying we have the tools to fight inflation should it break out. It doesn't keep saying what those tools are. And the reason is because those tools are not very pleasant when you look at them. The tool that the Fed has to contain inflation is to repeat 1979, 1980. Now, you two are too young. This is ancient history, but I was there. It was unpleasant, to say the least. The tool is to raise interest rates so sharply that you cause a massive recession, and to keep them there for 10 years, along with a fiscal retrenchment. In the U.S., we had a big supply-side fiscal reform, which helped along with the monetary reform. This is part that is not in the standard history, but anybody who's lived in Latin America knows you want to stop inflation, it's a joint fiscal monetary reform, and we did that. So the U.S. has, I think, neither the appetite for the fiscal reform nor for the monetary stringency it would take. When you ask our Fed, how is it planning to run monetary policy, the speeches could have been given in 1970. We're going to let inflation run really hot in order to bring down unemployment. The 1962 Phillips curve is back in strength. We're going to let inflation keep going for quite some time before we do anything about it. We're now worried about inequality and climate change, not just about controlling inflation. And we're not willing to talk about the hard measures that containing inflation would take. So that all in all, that doesn't seem, either viewing that or and the fiscal situation is now much worse than it was in 1980. 1980, we had a 25% debt to GDP ratio. Now we have 100 and increasing debt to GDP ratio, which means that raising interest rates will be very painful for the fiscal policy. Every time they raise interest rates, you raise interest on the debt, which is kind of a doom loop there. So I think the government, they talk about expectations are anchored. We have the tools. But, if it's sort of like threatening a war, if you're going to threaten a war, you better let people know what you got and that you're willing to use it. And I don't see that either on the fiscal and monetary side. So that's what it would take. Inflation isn't baked in. It takes a policy that would allow inflation to get going and fight it too slow, too late, too little for it to happen. And depending how cynical you are about the U.S. and the steadfastness of its policy to do hard things for long-run benefits, a point of view that is harder and harder to take as we watch the sad news out of Afghanistan, that suggests that there's certainly a possibility that inflation could break out, not just from current events, but from a policy unwilling to do what it takes to contain it. I think I've talked long enough. Marcos, how am I doing?
Well, I agree. I'm very much on this page that it's very difficult to predict inflation. And if you look at current process, on the surface, it seems that there are a lot of transitory components in inflation. You look at the core PCE like at 3.5%, is very above what the Fed is targeting. But if you look at what is pushing this inflation, you look at a lot of transitory things like reopening, things related to the reopening, like leisure, hospitality, things related to the supply chain, which brings to mind the car sector that is pushing the PCE a lot. And commodity prices also was a big impulse in inflation. Here in Brazil, we are feeling a lot this thing. You have reason to be calm at this point. If you look at the inflation expectations, it's well anchored. Even though you have PCE inflation at 3.5%, you look at inflation expectation for longer horizon, it's around 2%. So it seems to be fine. But the point that John raised, I think it's very important. Next year, it's another thing. We don't have much space there. Job market's closing very, very fast. You're not gonna have any slack there next year. You have some risks. I think about the risk in the housing sector, for example. Its prices are going up very high, and the way you measure inflation, you don't put rents over there, so it may be a risk. But the main problem is that how the Fed will fight inflation. One thing that John didn't mention, it's how the markets, financial markets, which it's our reality, it's addicted to this liquidity. So every time the Fed try to rise interest rates, it's kind of a crisis building up. And if inflation by any chance shows to be very persistent, above what the central bank is targeting, will the Fed be able to be aggressive on the interest rate hike? What will happen with the financial market in this situation? So far, so good. But next year, the trade-offs are much more difficult to make. So we can say that inflation is transitory, looking at the surface nowadays. But if you look next year, it's going to be another situation, and it could be hard for the Fed to fight if something goes wrong.
So I would just emphasize that with so back in the 1970s, the Fed, all the speeches were the same. Oh, it's just corn prices are high because there was bad weather, and there's a I'm making this up, but because I forgot what they actually were. There's a bottleneck in the Mississippi River. The Fed chairs were very good about constantly changing which measure of inflation they like to look at, because whichever one didn't go up. So the story of transitory and supply bottlenecks was every time inflation was rising in the 70s, they were saying the same thing. The house prices is an important, sort of stuff. It's really hard to get stuff off a ship right now, so you can kind of see those bottlenecks easing. But house prices, that has not yet found its way into the CPI. And even, Larry Summers has become an inflation hawk, and he's pointing this out as well. So that's a one of those things that's embedded, that, sort of like an exchange rate depreciation. You kind of know a bunch of inflation is coming as long as the house prices stay high, which they will. The expectations, I object to the word anchored because anchored doesn't, not moving doesn't mean anchored. A boat can be not moving because there's no wind, or because there's an anchor. Expectations aren't moving, but we don't know if they're anchored, and if so, by what. Now, anchored makes some sense if you think of it as people believe that the Fed would quickly take action should something happen. That's the only central bankers keep using the word anchor without saying it. That's the only meaning I can give to it, and that's exactly where disappearing faith that the Fed would take sharp action is important. You mentioned financial markets. I went back and looked. So financial markets never saw inflation coming in the 1970s, and they never saw inflation leaving in the 1980s. Bond yields did not go up ahead of inflation, and bond yields really did not go down ahead of disinflation. So, inflation is always and everywhere a surprise is quite true. But your point, what is going to stop the Fed from sharply raising interest rates? Well, let's start with it's deep into its mandate that, if there's anybody who still says they want a job and doesn't have one, it's not going to raise interest rates. And now it's taking on an inequality and social justice kind of campaign to keep interest rates low until everyone has a job. That's, how can that Fed cause a recession to stop inflation? There's the federal debt, which is large. Raising interest rates will Congress will go ballistic the Fed raises rates to 5%, that's $1 trillion a year on the deficit. Congress will go ballistic about that, as well as, what are you kicking all my constituents out of a job? And the thing you mentioned, which I just wanted to emphasize, financial markets. The Fed has, in a way, taken responsibility for stock and bond prices in a way that it certainly did not in the 1970s. In the pandemic, the Fed was just explicit. We're not going to let any bond price go down. They put a floor under treasuries. They put a floor under corporate bond prices. They started buying municipal bonds. And of course, they're holding the bag on the too big to fail banks, all of which are betting on low interest rates forever. So if you raise interest rates, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money and a lot of asset prices are going to go down. That the Fed has kind of pledged itself. Its idea of financial stability is never letting asset prices go down. So there's all sorts of things that are going to get in the way of a robust response should inflation actually get up.
So, John, keeping this line, last week we had Chairman Jeremy Powell talking about tapering. It seems that he's very calm. He has time. Probably our view here is that he will start. The Fed will start discuss tapering in September, announce something in November to effectively start tapering in December or January. Is this any reason for concern with that? How long the Jeremy Powell can keep this stimulus? Should he start raising rates or remove stimulus sooner than that? Is he too calm with this process? How do you think about this?
So first of all, I am surprised that our Fed talks about its future actions in unconditional terms, saying, and they just this one bit them back hard. They said, we're going to keep interest rates low for I don't know how many years. And then bing, something unexpected happened. Inflation popped out. So they're going to have to break that right away. I don't know why we're talking about tapering in terms of calendar times. I don't know why we talk about when we're leaving Afghanistan in terms of calendar times. Don't tell the enemy when you're about to leave. It's sort of like rule number one of the military history and financial history as well. The Fed should say, here are the conditions on the ground under which we're going to do stuff. That's the Taylor rule, which is a nice description of good monetary policy in many ways. Says, you do depending on what happens. So, the Fed will say, if X, then we'll start tapering. Now, tapering is hard for me because I cannot see any reason that quantitative easing in the form of buying treasury bills or selling treasury bills has any effect whatsoever on anything. And I think that summarizes a lot of academic research by people who are not employed by the Federal Reserve. You have to go deep into some sort of financial frictions to cook up a story for this one. Remember, right now, reserves pay interest. And reserves are held massively in abundance, way past all regulatory requirements. It's just a savings asset. So it is a change in the maturity structure of government debt. Does it really matter that much if you're holding overnight interest-paying reserves or if you're holding 2-week treasury bills? They're just, or a money market fund that holds 2-week treasury bills. This is like taking your red M&Ms and giving you green M&Ms and saying that's going to help your diet. So I didn't think QE did much on the way up. So I can't say that tapering it's going to do much on the way down. Now, it does have sort of a psychological effect. Everybody in the markets is going to go nuts here because everybody in the markets believes that we still live in 1965 and that by buying treasuries and issuing reserves, the Fed is providing liquidity, even though this is like your car takes 4 quarts of oil and you put in 25 gallons and now you say, well, we're going to taper that down to 24 gallons of oil and that's going to make a difference. You're just way past the point that more oil in the car makes any difference whatsoever. But it does, since everyone in the markets is convinced it matters, it is sort of a psychological thing. And I think Jim Hamilton did some great work on this, that it's an announcement of the Fed's general attitude. And it certainly makes sense as it's sort of first we taper and then we raise interest rates. So it's kind of a sense of where monetary policy is going. But the tapering per se Yes, I know there was a taper tantrum when Bernanke sneezed a while ago, and I know that Powell was there and is very scared of that fact. But as a matter of economics, changing the balance sheet of the federal government between 1 month treasuries and overnight interest-bearing reserves just cannot make that huge of a difference.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with you. It's kind of signaling to the markets where the monetary policy is going, because the Fed is putting a sequencing on that. So I'll start raising rates as soon as or around the time I end tapering. So markets are looking what the Fed is doing and well ahead and has time to prepare. That's the idea. And I think, to be honest, I think there in the middle of the crisis, the presence of the Fed was very important for bringing some stability to the markets. I think we discussed that a lot at the time. When the Fed came to the market, I don't know if it's like a psychological effect, but the fact is that it stopped the negative expiral in the market. And but at the margin, at this point, I agree with you, that doesn't make much difference.
No, so let me clarify. Yes, there's a big difference between purchases you make when a market is in turmoil, when a run is going on, and between the tapering that happens in a boom. There's an old expression: monetary policy can't push on a string. And another way of putting it is monetary policy can screw things up, but it can't really help on the other end. So when a market is dysfunctional or in distress or whatever, buying assets and giving banks who want to buy assets, lending money to banks so they can buy assets, clearly makes a difference. Now, why did the Fed get in the position that it had to do that? It was only 10 years ago, 2008, 2009, that we had a major crisis where the Fed bailed out right, left, and center. And then we had a major regulatory reform that was going to say, never, never again. We won't have to do this ever again, because the wonders of Dodd-Frank and the stress tests and the liquidity rules and the rest of it. And then time came and we had to bail out the banks so that they would buy U.S. treasuries. And then we bailed out the money market fund. Now, this isn't an undergraduate, a sophomore should be able to fill out a final exam saying, how do you fix money market funds so you don't have to bail them out once every 10 years? We failed that one and bailed out the money market funds. And then the Fed went on. Now, they didn't have to bail out the big banks this time because they floated before the ship was sinking, they floated the ocean. They started buying all those other assets as well. So at least last time we had the decency to say there's some moral hazard here. How did we get to the position that everybody is leveraged to the hilt and that we can't even trust the treasury markets to work on their own because the banks haven't kept enough money around to be able to intermediate in treasury markets? We are now firmly in, every time there's a crisis, the Fed is going to bail out right, left, and center, and this is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So yes, you're right. The Fed did, I was worried COVID was going to turn into a massive financial crisis, a big wave of bankruptcies. The Fed did stop that by the usual expedient, trillions of dollars of printed money everywhere and everywhere. But we ought to think a little bit about the moral hazard and maybe leaving people a tiny incentive to have some cash around next time to buy in the fire sales. Otherwise, this is just going to be a private reward, public taking up the risk in every crisis, bigger and bigger until they can't do it anymore, which would be an immense catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, moving to the questions of monetary policy that people prepared here, one of the well-known equations in economics is Phillips curve that posed the inverse relationship between inflation and employment. When you see an employment rate fell through last day, you ultimately hit 50-year low, it still was no material increase in inflation. Or putting another way, the Phillips curve was very flat. How monetary policy is it something structural, or does the way we think monetary policy should change in this environment, or is just a temporary phenomenon that the Fed should disconsider if going forward?
So another thing I thought we learned in the 1970s was that, Milton Friedman's 1968 presidential address, in the long run, the rate of unemployment has nothing to do with the rate of inflation, because it's a search and matching process to match people with jobs. We seem to have forgotten that. I mean, the Fed still seems to believe that they said it. We're going to let inflation run hot in order to drive down unemployment, or worse. Right now the issue is not so much. So your listeners who don't know all the technical jargon, unemployment is people who don't have a job and are actively looking for a job. A big issue in the United States is the labor force participation rate, namely the large number of people who are not even looking for a job in the first place. And kind of a crisis of our society. The number of men 25 to 50 years old who are not even looking for a job is at an all-time high. And that's very puzzling. I don't mean to be gendered about this, but that's a category of people who traditionally, pretty much all of them worked, and now they're not. So the Fed is not just thinking about unemployment, thinking about employment. But, if you're struggling, scratching your head to figure out how the rate of inflation has anything to do with the unemployment rate, scratch some more to figure out how it has something to do with the labor force participation rate. Now, it is true, in the last economic boom, which ended with COVID, our unemployment rates and labor force participation rates went down dramatically, especially among disadvantaged demographic groups. We had not seen that much employment going on. Wages were going up. Inequality was shrinking as of February 2020 because of the booming hot economy, but a booming hot economy with no inflation in it. So booming hot economies are great for the labor market, but does this have anything to do with inflation? Remember, the Phillips curve started as a statistical association, and there's never been kind of a coherent theory of the Phillips curve. The best was Phelps and Lucas, I'd say, in the 1970s. The idea that if the central bank has an unannounced big push of inflation, it prints up a bunch of money, that gets a boom going, and until the prices catch up, there's a little bit of inflation. But so what you think of is, if labor markets are really tight and companies can't hire workers, they'll have to pay more wages, and so you'll get inflation, right? But wait a minute, workers want real wages. They want more wages relative to prices. And you might think, if product markets are really tight, prices will go up, but that's prices relative to wages. What makes inflation overall? Prices and wages don't rise one relative to the other, but they both go up. It's not obvious why that has anything to do with the rate of unemployment. So it's always been on theoretically shaky ground. It's kind of a cloud of points now. Now, you said the words flat Phillips curve, and this is a fun argument I've had with a bunch of Fed economists. So if you make a plot, what you see is a cloud. It looks like a galaxy, just a cloud of points. Well, if you run a regression through a cloud of points, it depends whether you run y on x or x on y. But if you run y on x, you fit a flat line with a very low r squared. So what do you make of that flat line? Well, one way is they say the Phillips curve is really flat. I had a very creative Fed economist say, yeah, the Phillips curve is flat. This is wonderful. What that means is that if we change inflation just a tiny, tiny little bit, we can eliminate unemployment. It's brilliant, isn't it? But when you look at the cloud of points around the line, you get wait, this isn't an exploitable, a rock hard but very flat relationship. This is just a cloud of points that has nothing to do with each other anymore, which is sort of my view of the Phillips curve.
And I struggle with the idea that the Fed can reach many objectives with the interest rate. Like in the past, people used to talk the Fed is going to target 2% inflation, the maximum employment. So it's already a very, very difficult thing to do. And now, what do you make of this conversation that the Fed should be like some kind of ESG kind of objectives in the monetary policy, like fight diversity and be inclusive, all with the interest rate. I think it's very difficult. Although it's very valid, I think the concerns are very valid, I think. But I struggle how the Fed can achieve so many objectives with so few instruments.
Yeah, so I'm kind of old-fashioned, and there's a 1990s view that sort of said, look, the best way to maximize employment is to reduce volatility. The best way to do that is just to keep the inflation rate as constant as possible. And with that, you've done your job. And if more people don't want jobs, that's a problem with the labor market. Labor market regulations, the horrible disincentives to work of social programs, there's nothing the Fed, can do about that. So hold inflation constant and stop pretending you're in charge. What you bring up, there's a classic theorem in monetary economics, which is one target, one instrument, which is it's very hard to do multiple things with one target, be that the money supply or the interest rate. Those central banks keep trying, and their mandates keep expanding from price stability, which somehow turned into 2% inflation. I don't know how price stability became 2% inflation forever, but it did. And then maximum employment, whatever that means, and then financial stability. In most countries, they worry explicitly about the exchange rate. So the number of things you're trying to hit with one arrow is hard enough. But on where central banks is going now, to ESG, climate change, diversity, social justice, and so forth. I think this is partly influencing interest rate policy, but I think it's a mistake to think of central banks primarily in terms of monetary policy at all anymore. The influence of the central bank on the economy is not the level of the short-term federal funds rate. It is the massive regulatory apparatus. So the plan, for example, to put climate change into what central banks do is not a plan to think about short-term interest rates. It's a plan to rev up this massive regulatory apparatus and basically to tell banks, bank, nice bank you got there. It would be a shame if something should happen to it. Lending money to fossil fuel companies is really not so good anymore. That's the environmental part of it. The SG part, let's not forget ESG has the SG into it too. So, you don't have enough diversity on your board of directors. You shouldn't be lending money to that company. Oh, you're not letting unions into your workforce. Boy, that's, I think that I smell a financial risk there. Now, this is clearly the agenda, and central banks had it coming. After 2009, they vastly increased their regulatory oversight. They were telling banks, literally, they had 150 embedded regulators in every bank signing off on every major deal, telling the banks what to do and what not to do. Then they aggrandized themselves to start thinking about, we're going to do macroprudential policy and prick bubbles here, there, and the other place and allocate credit to where it belongs. And no surprise that people see this vastly powerful institution. And then they started buying, by the way, they started buying securities. So in Europe already, the European Central Bank is buying up green bonds in order to subsidize its ideas of what are good green ideas and what are bad green ideas. And I say subsidized because if it weren't, the private sector would buy up these bonds. So why don't we use the power to print money and lend it out for social goals? The problem with all this, of course, is that central banks are not, in the US, the central bank isn't legally allowed to do this. So you got to come up with some sort of phony baloney excuse for doing it, or just go ahead and do it. I mean, the climate risk idea is the fantasy that it's doing to start imposing climate stuff. But the social part of it, you can't even pretend there's a risk there. But they're just going to go ahead and do it. So in short, central banks have become much, much more powerful. When you think of a central bank, just that the interest rate policy now is just it's the little cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. The important thing about what central banks are doing is their asset purchases, who they lend money to, and centrally their regulation, how they tell banks, who should you lend to and who should you not lend to, and then increasingly what kind of assets they directly buy, as they, bought state and local government bonds in the crisis to directly fund things.
Yeah, let me propose an inversion here in the agenda here. Let me connect a question on ESG. It's becoming very in fashion, the ESG concept in the firms. I'm usually, as a good Chicago student, I remember Friedman's idea that the main objective of a firm is to make money. So, and now you are putting multiple objectives in the firm's objective function. I understand the G part, the governance part. I think we learn a lot. There's some information problems, asymmetries problems that, for example, ownership and management, you should deal with this with some sort of contract. I understand the governance that you should be able, but the ES part of ESG, should it be also a concern of the firm? Because it seems to me that you are passing to the firm something that be the concern of the governments in terms of regulatory environment that the firm should operate.
Well, the G part of
many objectives there, the firm will drive firm away from the main objective, which is maximizing profits.
The G part of the governance is not about regulation and transparency. It's about social objectives in how the firm runs things. So they want the companies to enact their social goals. This is a great question. So on the one hand, I'm a free marketer, and if the owners of a company want the company to go down the E, S, and G agenda, which is not just climate change, not just environment, it is their definitions of social justice and governance, and really enact to go along with a fairly extensive, rather left-wing political agenda. Well, if the owners of the company, the stockholders, want to do that, more power to them. It's kind of hard to object to that. Now, how can one object? First of all, a lot of this stuff is being run through the government. So, the Securities and Exchange Commission, on the other hand, is much less better positioned to require ESG. And there are agency conflicts here, which are very important. So the actual owners of the company, you and me, tend not to get to vote on these E, S, and G issues. So, for example, I have a lot of money in Vanguard. Vanguard has a total market portfolio. And how do they vote their shares? Well, they are increasingly voting their shares into ESG metrics. I'm not, I believe in environment, social, and governments, but I have very different ideas about what a company should be doing. So they are not representing my voice that way. BlackRock, the head of BlackRock, has decided to go full on this sort of thing. Well, how many of the actual investors in BlackRock want Larry Fink's personal ideas of what constitutes ESG? And so, if you could just get a hold of the share voting advisory services, you can have a very large impact. So, whereas you can't really object to owners of a firm doing whatever they want with their company. If they want to make less money in order to advance social goals, power to them. In fact, I think we should get rid of the entire nonprofit agenda and have just regular corporations who sacrifice profits in the interest of their owners' view of social change. Go for it. But the agency conflict between what the investors want and what the company is doing is very large. And where this shows up, now again, central banks are not legally allowed to get it in their heads to go save the planet. They're just not allowed to do that. Why? Because in a democracy, an independent agency can't do that. You need a politically accountable agency. If we're going to print money and invest in, windmills or electric cars or whatever, that's a job of the Treasury. That's not a job of an independent central bank. And that's why there are laws against a central bank doing it. And that's why central banks have to dream up scenarios that say, oh, but this is really a risk. We're not trying to help the climate. We're just worried about the risk, which is patently, obviously false. Now, the same thing is true here. The fiduciaries are not allowed to, if you are a asset manager for a pension fund, you are not allowed to say, well, I want to invest this stuff in a socially responsible way. Why? Because you are representing the interests of 1 million people who are the beneficiaries of this pension fund, and you haven't found out if they're willing to sacrifice their returns in this way. So they're not allowed to do it. Although, getting a hold of the regulatory apparatus is a wonderful way to force policy changes that you cannot get through legally elected, an elected legislature or even an elected presidency. Just get it through in the rules. And that's why there are fiduciary rules that say you're simply not allowed to do this. And that's why we have to pretend that ESG is actually profitable as opposed to it. Obviously, anytime you restrict your portfolio choice, it's going to be unprofitable. So it's a more delicate issue.
Yeah, very complicated. And well, coming back to monetary policy, I know I remember your classes on fiscal theory of price level. I did the classes back in 2002. I think it was maybe in the beginning of your research in this area. I will ask you to explain the concepts to an undergrad that is watching us here. What is fiscal theory of price level? How is this research advanced at this point? And how you use it? You already mentioned a lot the use of this framework to think about monetary policy in the current environment. But do you think it's still useful? What's the lessons that you can get from there?
I hope so, because I've been doing not much else since 2002, and I hope I've made some progress since I inflicted you with my early and very unformed ideas on the topic. Where does inflation come from? Fundamentally, where does the value of the dollar come from? It's an age-old question. The fiscal theory of the price level explores an age-old answer that it's really asset pricing imperialism. That fundamentally, if you want to think about what is a stock worth, you say, well, what's the present value of the dividends? If you want to think about what's a bond worth, you say, well, they've promised to pay you blah, 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 take the present value, that's what the bond's worth. If you want to think about what the dollar is worth, well, recognize that the dollar is just one part of U.S. government debt. And so you ask, what is U.S. government debt worth? And the answer is, the U.S. government, first answer is, well, it's the present value of the fiscal surpluses that will pay back that debt. And so your first inclination is, well, and that's the theory, that the value of the dollar is set by the value of U.S. government debt overall. And that is set by how much debt's out there versus people's trust that the U.S. government will someday, after it's tried everything else, raise taxes. And by that, I mean reform the tax code so that it produces adequate revenue. Raising tax rates isn't going to do the trick. Or reform our spending programs so that they come in under taxes so that we can actually pay off the debt. And for some reason, inflation remains sort of low, although it's not for so long, but that's sort of the fundamental framework in thinking about it. Now, I got to say, boy, I got to get this book out fast because for 30 years, I've been worrying about inflation and deficits. And for 30 years, we've had no inflation and big deficits. This finally might be my moment. So, you never know in economics how long that'll last. So grab it. That's the central idea. Now, that's so obvious. You say, but, why didn't I think about that? What makes it interesting is the contrast with traditional theory. So, the one most people are familiar with is the idea that inflation comes from too much money chasing too many goods. Well, fiscal theory is consistent with that. Too much money and too much government debt chasing too few goods causes inflation. One of the central differences, though, if you believe in the money theory, you think that a government like the U.S. with a huge amount of government debt, all it has to do is have less money, less reserves, and more official treasury debt, and that's the answer. that changing the composition of government debt to less money and more debt is the secret. Whereas fiscal theory sort of points you in the direction that, it's the overall amount relative to the capacity to pay off the debt that is really the key important thing. So it's a simple theory. What takes 800 pages is not so much explaining the theory, but uniting it with current New Keynesian models and seeing how it's different from other theories and trying to start telling stories about how does it work in real life. Here, by the way, I obviously need to learn a lot more about Brazil because
yes,
you guys have a much more interesting history of inflations coming and going, and the inflations both coming and going clearly from joint monetary and fiscal affairs than just, the view it's just central bank stupidity will not hold against Brazilian history. I know enough Brazilian history to know that. And when you're going to put inflation back in the bottle, you need a joint monetary fiscal reform. Any amount of Brazilian history or Argentinian history tells you that. So those lessons ought to, hopefully someday I'll learn more about Brazil and write the fiscal theory of Brazil paper, although some of those have been written.
I'd love to read.
Yes, when I see you guys worrying about the fiscal problems in the US, I think, I come down here. You learn our problems here in the fiscal, and you stop worrying about the US very, very soon.
Well, you are right that American economists are incredibly, we just don't know a lot about just simple facts. Well, American economists don't know about simple facts of history in the US anymore because we don't teach that in graduate school, but Americans in general are shockingly ignorant of Latin American history and Latin American economic history. It's just not taught in the schools. I realize with shame, my own education, which was pretty good, in a very good American high school and college curriculum, there was no Latin American history. Now that may be changing now as we're more interested in other parts of the world, but I didn't even know there was a
as we talk now, I think we have exactly this problem here in Brazil. Inflation is going up very high. The central bank is very hiking interest rate like crazy, and the inflation keeps going up. It's because one of the problems that people are discussing is the fiscal problem. People are losing confidence that the government can come back to the austerity trajectory. So this is more interesting, I think, laboratory for you to think about fiscal policy, in my opinion.
Well, we may be there soon. I think one of the mechanisms, Loyo did this in his thesis. One of the mechanisms is you start raising interest rates and you have borrowed short-term. Short-term debt is the poison in the well here. And it's shocking that the US is borrowing short-term, but you raise interest rates with short-term debt, the deficit increases. People were worried about your debt before. Now you got another $1 trillion on the books every year. They worry even more, and that kind of spirals out of control.
Yeah,
so,
exactly what's happening here.
Glad to know it. Well, glad to know it for theory. I'm sorry for Brazil.
Well, in this line, Biden has not presented any plan of how to repay this ballooning American debt. Do you think that can lead to a fiscal problem in the future and the U.S. losing its status as the world's reserve currency?
Yes. Next question. No. Yes, obviously. The U.S. is following the trajectory of many ossified failing empires, one which ends with borrowing way too much money and not having a plan how to pay it off until the crisis comes, and then you're unable to do the crisis. Now, the reserve currency question is another one. I think it's kind of overstated how much, that's a finite benefit that you get out of people. Just to invoice in dollars, you don't have to hold dollars. So I think we could, do people want to hold a lot of dollars? Could blow up a lot quicker with electronic. It's amazing to me people want to hold as many dollars as they do, because if you're a bank and you can buy stuff in 20 milliseconds, So in order to transact in dollars, you don't have to hold a lot of dollars. So it's interesting that we have as much, and the trends, foreigners are not buying U.S. debt nearly as much as they were anymore. So for the last year or so, the Federal Reserve has been the one buying U.S. debt. Now, foreigners seem to be willing to hold reserves. They haven't yet figured out that reserves are U.S. government debt. On the other hand, so the question is in favor of what? Europe is not doing a whole lot better than the U.S. You want to hold money in China? Good luck to you. I mean, you can hold money in China as long as you have no interest in getting money out of China. There's not a whole lot of Swiss francs to go around, buy Venezuelan currency, I think, if you want still, but no one wants to buy a lot of that.
You can try Bitcoins. You can try Bitcoins with 40% variation in a week.
Well, and also, look, when the debt crisis comes, the tax collector comes with it. So any debt crisis comes with a, quote, one-time, unquote, capital levy and a lot of expropriation of assets. So good luck to you I mean, maybe if you keep those offshore or something, there's not Bitcoin isn't going to save you. But I was going to say, my nightmares include sort of a global sovereign debt crisis, not just a U.S. sovereign debt crisis. And then even my capacity for doom and gloom is I get kind of foggy when we're going down and Europe's going down. And imagine what happens. There's a war somewhere. China invades Taiwan. God knows what happens. People decide that the U.S. isn't going to pay off anymore, but that's when Italy defaults. And is the Eurozone, some great oasis of great growth and financial stability and surpluses to back their debts? Doesn't look like it either. And then this is just so much. You painted it as the U.S. lose the status of the world's currency, and so you think of yourselves as us just sort of fading away to be something like Holland, which is, used to be a great empire and now is a very nice country to live in. But a sovereign debt crisis, a global sovereign debt crisis, where the dollar loses its status in financial markets is such a calamity. It's not just about invoicing your payments in something else and holding a little more currency and just dollars in some currency or SDRs or something of the sort. Our financial system is based on the idea that short-term U.S. government debt is inviolate. And if banks give up on that, and along with it, the U.S. government loses its ability to borrow a ton of money and bail everybody out in every crisis, then, the best thing is nobody's expecting a bailout and the bailout comes. The worst thing is everybody's expecting a bailout and the bailout doesn't come. And that's, in a global sovereign debt crisis, that's what happens. And now it's just a calamity beyond even my ability to think about doom and gloom. They call me the grumpy economist for a reason. But
I agree. That's exactly the point. I don't see an alternative, viable alternative to the dollar. If the dollar goes down, everything goes down together with. You don't have Europe. Doesn't seem a good alternative. China, as you said, if you look at what happened in the last few weeks, it's a good example of what could happen with your money if you put the money there. So it's very difficult.
The alternatives are what we build from the ashes, but those are ashes.
Yes, that's true. And going this question, you talked about the U.S. finance its debt using perpetuities. It seems to me when I read that it's something like take advantage of your exorbitant privilege while it lasts. Is this the spirit of the things?
So that's there's a lot of. So I have a proposal. Find it on my website on restructuring federal debt, and I love perpetuities for a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is the U.S. now has like 300. I won't get the number right, but it's on the order of magnitude of 300 different securities outstanding, and we worry about the liquidity of government debt. Well, here's a way to make it liquid. How about having one security outstanding? Perpetuities, when you issue a new 5-year bond, it's a different security than last year's 5-year bond. So if I short one, I can't deliver the other, and that makes them illiquid. If I issue perpetuities, I'm always just issuing more of the same security. So you have one CUSIP, one security, just tremendous liquidity in perpetuities. So I love perpetuities for that reason. I would have fixed rate and floating rate perpetuities, so you can have whatever maturity structure you want. So that's part of it. Perpetuities would make debt much more liquid and help the US government to borrow at even lower rates. The second part, though, is by issuing perpetuities, you're issuing very long-term debt. So we talked about this mechanism that interest rates go up, the costs of the debt goes up. That means your deficits go up, and that means you're in even more trouble. Well, you're out of that if you borrow very long-term, and there's nothing long-term like perpetuities. There's any household who's thinking about borrowing to buy a house. You can borrow an adjustable rate mortgage, or you can borrow a fixed rate mortgage. The adjustable rate's a little bit lower. So you save some money if interest rates don't go up. If interest rates do go up, you lose the house. So do you want, it's like buying insurance. Let's buy a little bit of insurance. You pay a little bit higher rate, but if interest rates go up, you get to keep the house. So I think that the US is now in a similar situation. Long-term rates are like 1.6%. Short-term rates are like 0.5%. I hope I got these numbers right. It was about right. So yeah, you pay 1% more in return for the insurance. If the US funded everything long-term, there would never be a debt crisis. You can't have a debt crisis if you don't have to roll over the debt, or at least it's a very slow rolling crisis. It's not a run. All debt crises are rollover crises. So you just eliminate the chance of a rollover for a measly. Okay, so we have to pay 2.5% on our long-term bonds instead of paying 1.5% on our long-term bonds. That seems to be worth it. And this is a fun. Actually, when I first presented this, Larry Summers and Robin Greenwood gave a contrary paper. This was at the Treasury Department. And they argued, no, we should go for the short rates because it's 1% cheaper, and that could never happen. And I noticed Larry has since changed his mind, and he's been beating the drumbeat. This thing's insane for the U.S. to borrow short-term, and even more insane for the Fed to buy up whatever long-term debt the Treasury actually does issue and turn it into overnight debt, which is, of course, overnight debt is the thing that explodes in every financial crisis. So I haven't talked to Larry, but I count him now as a supporter. So perpetuities do two things. One, it's a much better kind of debt for all sorts of reasons. It's more liquid, excuse me, but it would allow the government to borrow much longer if they wake up to say they should do it. Sorry, I got so excited I lost my voice.
Well, I think another situation that you can analyze the Brazilian situation. We have this dynamic a lot, and we are seeing it again now. Every time you have fiscal concerns, the dynamics in the Treasury start to shorten the maturity of the debt. So when everything is fine, you can borrow at 10 years. Here in Brazil is very long for you to know, 10 years. And now the government is again, don't want to pay because 10 years, if you look 10 years in Brazil, if you look at the curve here is around 10%. So the Treasury don't want to pay that. It will shorten the maturity of the rates. But the central bank is keep rising rates to keep inflation down. So the fiscal risk will increase next year. That's the problem. But this dynamic is very clear here in Brazil. I don't know if you ever saw this, but here we live every week we observe the Treasury going to the market and try to roll over the debt in a short maturity.
No, and that is the that's why I think it's especially important for the U.S. now. It's 1.6% at 10 years in the U.S. That's an amazing opportunity, and we're saying, oh no, we only want to pay 0.5%. We don't want to pay 1.6%. I think the Brazilian Treasury would wet its pants to borrow at 10 years at 1.6%.
And the real rates are negative. Real rates are negative in the U.S.
Dramatic. Right? We're 4 or 5% inflation, 1.6% interest rates. They're paying you to take the money, and you don't want to do it. But you're exactly right. It's not as easy as I made it sound because it's like when your bedroom has burned down and you show up to say, I'd like to buy some house insurance. They say, well, it's going to be pretty expensive house insurance, and that's the problem. If the Brazilian government says, so we want to borrow long term so that we can insure ourselves against big inflation, people go, why do you want to buy that insurance anyway? And that's why governments, like companies, everybody is forced to short-term debt as they approach bankruptcy.
It's kind of a signaling device that the central bank is using, the treasury is using, right? Yeah.
Well, you would only buy the long-term debt if you know that it's going to be even worse than that. And then the markets say, oh, they think it's going to be worse than that, and things get bigger still. You have to credibly signal that you don't need the insurance in order to buy the insurance.
Well, maybe a last question, right? I think we are running out of time here.
Yeah,
it's something that
for one last question. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's something that is in fashion now. It's about that we already discussed it a little bit in another questions, but the climate change. Do you think climate change can affect economic growth? If it does, what's the solution? If you carbon tax, for example, is it a solution or there's some kind of regulation? When I look at this question, I remember like something also from Chicago, the Coase theorem. It looks like carbon tax is trying to implement that theorem in practice. I don't know what you would think about that.
Yeah, well, you wanted a short question, eh?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I know you.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You have already wrote it about it. I've read it in The Economist about it, so I want to hear it again.
Well, I have a new essay coming out of this in the next week or so, but I think it's a mistake to argue about the climate as a scientific question, because the economics is the most uncertain, both on what's the economic effect and what should we do about it. So let's not argue. Let's just say whatever the IPCC says as far as climate, we'll take the meteorology. Now let's argue about the economics. It is, when you look at the numbers of all of the models, the effects of climate change on GDP are very small and very uncertain. So even the IPCC says about 2.5% in the year 2100. Even if you take scenarios that say no mitigation at all, you come up with 5%. Now 5% of GDP sounds like a lot of numbers until you think about what economic growth is going to do for the next 100 years. I just worked it out, so I know. Compounding. We're at 2% growth now in the US. That's horribly low, but that's what it is. 2% growth for the next 80 years makes us 400% richer than we are now. And we're whining about 5% more or less. This is just nothing compared to growth. If growth would go up to 3% in 80 years, we would be 1,000% richer than we are now. So growth, 5% of GDP is just swamped in growth. And especially look across countries. So India has $2,000 of GDP per capita. The US is 60,000, 1/30 of the value. The problem for the world's poor is not 5% of GDP 100 years from now. The problem for the world's poor is look a little more like the US, please, and just swamps GDP. Europe, the GDP per capita in Europe is about 40% less than the US, which is fairly, that's the cost of a big welfare state. And maybe they're happy with 40% less, but that means that climate change, the effects of climate change are 1/10 as large as the difference of going from US to Europe. I think Europe's kind of a nice place. It's not, apocalypse Armageddon times 10. It's kind of a nice place to live. You must think so too. So these are just the economic costs of climate change are just very small, and they're very uncertain. I started looking into the models. Most of the number comes from statistical association of temperature with productivity now. Well, the problem with that. What are we holding constant here, guys? Just because it's less productive where it's hotter. You look within the US, once we invented air conditioning, everybody's moving from New York to Texas. They're moving out of California going to Texas. And those climate differences are way bigger than climate change. It is just not obvious that an advanced industrial going to services economy is that affected by weather. Fires, floods, hurricanes, even if that stuff is getting worse, it just doesn't blip GDP. So I think the climate change people would be well advised to just forget about it and to say, look, we want to save the environment and it's going to cost you GDP. And then they need to be a lot clearer about what are the environmental costs and whether it makes more sense to spend $1 trillion on a high-speed train to help the environment in 2100, or to spend $1 trillion buying up the entire state of Nebraska and giving it to the elephants. I'm deadly serious. $1 trillion is the kind of money we're talking about, would buy you a whole lot on the environment right now. So I think actually, if we gave up on the economic argument and just said, this is not the answer to how do we fix the economy. This is not the answer to what are the cataclysmic dangers. The dangers to the economy are war, nuclear war, revolution, more pandemic, crop failure, all the terrible stuff that go wrong. The dangers to Western civilization is not slow climate change of a couple degrees. So they should make the environmental argument. And then this is where economists are good. We're good at budget constraints. We're good at cost benefit analysis. We're good at you got $1 trillion you want to spend on the environment. Good. Is it better to spend it cleaning up chemical pollution, cleaning up the poor people face horrible environmental problems, which are not the disparate effects of climate change. They have smoky air, chemical pollution, horrible water, easily preventable diseases. Well, you got $1 trillion. We could spend it on that instead of spending it on a high-speed train that might reduce carbon emissions. Well, let's make those trade-offs. Now, what to do about it? Economists love carbon taxes, or let's not get into carbon taxes versus carbon property rights. This is the sort of thing where at 2 o'clock in the morning after we've had a little too much to drink is fun to talk about Coase theorems and so forth. But a price on carbon is the natural economic answer. Instead of an enormous amount, instead of putting the Federal Reserve and the Securities and Exchange Commission in charge of ESG requirements to defund fossil fuels and to subsidize whatever's popular at Davos this year, carbon taxes are just way more effective and way less costly because they let both. There's an incentive. If you buy someone an electric car, he has no incentive to move closer to work. Maybe the answer is move closer to work. That kind of stuff you never get out of the regulatory approach. And incentivizing useful innovation. This really the only answer is innovation. So incentivizing innovation, the only way that's going to work is if you can, if it makes work in a competitive market. The idea of we're going to defund fossil fuels, and then the federal government's going to decide which new technologies to subsidize. That's a terrible way of getting innovation going. And really, innovation is, I'm going to get there, the only answer. But the carbon taxes still have the advantage that we don't know really how much damage there is to the economy, but given what you're going to do, it's always much more effective to do it out of carbon taxes. So I used to be a big carbon tax fan. But a kind of reality hit me. First, Esteban Rossi Hansberg and I forget the co-author had a wonderful article where they point out what's also in the IPCC reports, if you read carefully. All anti-carbon policy ever does is delay climate change. The amount of climate change is robustly related to the amount of carbon we release. So if you have carbon emissions, which means you just take twice as long to do it, you just put off how long the damage is. That's one important point. The other important point was the newspaper headline from about a month ago where the Biden administration, fresh off of canceling the Keystone 2 pipeline, fresh off of mandating a whole of government effort to defund fossil fuels, fresh off of banning oil and gas leases on federal lands and trying to stop fracking, pleaded with OPEC to turn on the spigots to keep down the price of gas. So that tells you a lot, and it tells you that politically raising the price of energy in a way that you can see responsibility for it is not likely to happen. And that's, I think, why they're doing the regulatory approach. They say, oh, gas is $8 a gallon, but I don't know why. Whereas if you actually have a carbon tax, then the voters figure out what's going on. And so I've been following Bjorn Lomborg, who I heartily recommend, who's kind of weaned me off of carbon taxes as the answer to the answer, making what we do now more expensive. Really, the answer has got to be innovation. Now, that comes out of carbon taxes. If you want them, the major thing is to spur innovation. Also, what carbon taxes would do, and at least please regulators start using some cost benefit analysis. tell us everything you want to do. Tell us how much carbon is this going to save and how much is that going to reduce global temperature in the year 2100, and explain to us what 3 zeros after the decimal point means, because that's what most of the stuff does. But if you're going to be honest about this, the technical answers have to include nuclear power, which is very unpopular in the environmental lobby. Nuclear power does not emit carbon. Can I state a fact? It has to emit carbon capture and storage. At least we should look into it. That's very unpopular because it's licensed to keep burning fossil fuels, which is kind of like a sin and redemption story. But if you care about the environment, technology, and if you think that global warming is a civilization ending thing, you ought to be willing to talk about geoengineering to stop the global warming. It's not the first best solution, but if you're not willing to talk about it, then you're not serious about the climate is ending. Now, how can those and the 100 new technologies we don't know about, how can that all happen? It's not going to happen with the Federal Reserve subsidizing whatever is popular at Davos this year. At least honest, straightforward cost-benefit analysis in competition for subsidies. And that's the case for carbon tax kind of approaches as well. And I'll close with a thought I had in this essay. Suppose it's 1921 and you've been told that carbon is a problem. And your job is to figure out the economic effects of carbon and what are we supposed to do about it for the 20th century. You don't know that air conditioning might exist in the future. You don't know anything about the technologies that we have now. That tells you that, think about the technological change since 1921. Well, that's the technological change of the next century. So deciding now that we need to put catalytic converters on Ford Model Ts or revert to high-speed horse and buggies instead of coal-powered railroads, making those kind of decisions with that, it's just completely a hopeless opportunity. So really embrace the opportunities of technical change is, I think, that's where the policy has to go if it's going to do anything. It's extraordinarily politicized. So if the question is, how do I produce a lot of green pork for my constituents? Well, current policy is going to be really good at that. If the question is, how do I get applause at Davos? Then the current policy is really good at that. But you just look at the numbers on even Green New Deal, and it just doesn't do a whole lot to change the climate in the year 2100.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fashion there and very little economics behind the discussion, I think. It's very popular to defend these themes here. All the political agenda that you see, it try to include something in this direction. But really, the very deep economic analysis is missing. I think your work is very important on this line.
Let me just emphasize what question are we answering here? If the question is how to raise GDP in the year 2100, the answer is growth. And growth is very unpopular because all the vested interests hate it. If the question is how to help the world's poor, the answer is doubly growth because climate is just tiny against that. If the question is how to save Western civilization from likely things that could end it, there's 10 things on the agenda before climate change.
But I think the discussions that I see is more on this line. It's not the economic benefit that you get from that, but it's something that humanity is heading towards its final destination with the global warming. So you have to prevent that.
Well, I think
that's the way the discussion all the discussions I see, at least from here, is this line. You have to defend it because the planet will blow out the planet if you don't embrace this agenda.
That's just not in any of the science. Now, I worry about the end of civilization and I worry about an environmental calamity, but carbon doesn't, in the IPCC report, they have low probability, low confidence scenarios that they talk about, meaning, fairy tales we've made up. I think we should worry about preserving our civilization, preserving our economy. We should worry about, we've really changed the biology of this planet in dramatic ways, and how long is that sustainable? But no healthy civilization ever fell apart from something moving slowly like this. Temperature rise, some places get better, some places get worse. The biggest temperature rise was 10,000 years ago when the ice sheets melted. It was the greatest thing ever for humanity. Sea level rise, Amsterdam's 6 feet underwater. It's been since the 1600s. This is not a civilization-ending danger. There are civilization-ending dangers out there, both environmental, social, and political. And I think we should be paying attention. In fact, a lot of what annoys me, you can tell I'm annoyed by carbon policy and sort of green virtue signaling. It is blinding us to the genuine dangers we face. And merging it with financial regulation is blinding us to the financial dangers. This global sovereign debt crisis we talked about is going to happen a lot sooner than a climate-induced financial panic. And that everybody at central banks is busy worrying about climate is blinding them to the actual dangers they face.
Yeah, that shares an interesting
topic. The elephants are going to die in 80 years, not because it gets hot, but because people are going to shoot them and because they don't have any land to live on. No, this is serious. We're in a species extinction, and it started in 10,000 BC. The dodo didn't die because the planet got warmer. The dodo died because people shot them, and they don't have land for animals. You want to worry about species extinction, there's plenty to worry about, but it's not just because the planet's going to get warmer.
Yeah, I've read Sapiens. Sapiens says a lot about that. But as we head to the final stages of our panel, I'd like to ask both of you if you'd like to add any final considerations here.
That's a dangerous.
I just want to say it was a enormous pleasure to talk about with Cochrane. It's very honest. I liked very much his classes. In Chicago, it's not very common to be a good teacher. But he was a very, very good teacher, and I keep remembering his classes until today, and I use in my analysis in the markets often. Thank you very much, Cochrane. It was very, very good to talk with you.
Well, I can't take away your grades, so you don't need to flatter me anymore. But it's been a pleasure to see you again, Marcos, and a pleasure to meet you, Felipe. And thank you, everybody else, for listening.
So thank you very much. It was a very interesting panel. And now one last message to our viewers. So the Financial Market Week lasts until Friday. And now at 7 p.m. Brazilian time, we're having another panel with Guilherme Maeda and André Street. So I hope to see you all there. And that's it. Bye.